Jeff, let's turn to you first. Donald Trump's new lawsuit. A spokesperson for the Des Moines Register acknowledged that the poll did not reflect what ended up happening, but pointed out that they released all of their data and they're standing by their reporting. They said they will defend their First Amendment rights and believe this lawsuit is without merit. Even if it is, even if a judge throws this thing out of court, it's going to take time and it will be costly. What is Donald Trump's real goal here?
Well, I mean, what is his real goal? I think one is just to make a point. And he said in his press conference yesterday at Mar-a-Lago that it was going to be costly. And I think he was referring to it being costly to him. But it was worth it because he wants to make this point about the media and he wants to make a point about what he believes in this case was a wrong poll. But in general, I think the broader point is anything, whether it's media coverage or whether it's polling, that was not positive to him and that he feels is misleading is worth a lawsuit. Remember that President Trump, President-elect Trump now, and former President Trump, before he was in politics, was already a very litigious man. That instinct is sticking with him now, and he's launching his second term as president of the United States with these attacks and with these lawsuits. What the Des Moines Register said and the pollster is spot on. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't comment or analyze whether this lawsuit has any validity or not. But I certainly can say as a consumer of polls and as a reporter who uses them, polls don't always get it right. Candidates don't always like their polling, just like candidates don't always like their media coverage or the stories that are written about them or reported about them. That doesn't make it all of a sudden worthy of a lawsuit.
Peter, litigious is a nice way of putting it. What Donald Trump had a reputation for before he became president was simply stiffing or underpaying all sorts of contractors, subcontractors, businesses that he owed money to. He just wouldn't pay, and then he'd say, sue me. And he'd be much bigger and have law firms on retainer. And he would squeeze some of those smaller businesses until they said, mercy, forget it. You've bankrupted me in legal fees. I'll go out of business. You never have to pay. Now there are media law experts that are pointing out what he's doing here with the Des Moines Register may serve as an example to others who might want to punish local journalists who do not have deep pockets. How real is this possibility? If you're a local paper, even if you are spot on in all of your reporting, just the thought of major lawsuits could cripple you.
Well, I think that's right. Exactly. Winning the lawsuit isn't necessarily the only goal, right? Simply lodging the lawsuit and forcing a process that can go on for years, that costs a journalism organization potentially millions of dollars in legal fees, that in fact inhibits or discourages tough coverage. That's a goal by itself. Remember, Donald Trump once sued Tim O'Brien, who used to work for the New York Times, for writing a book. And in the book, he said, that is, Tim O'Brien said that the future president of the United States was not worth as much money as he liked to brag that he was. And for that alone, it was enough to anger then Donald Trump. And he sued him and he didn't win. But he said he was still glad that he did it because he caused Tim O'Brien, the journalist, all kinds of heartache and money and all that kind of thing. And that's exactly enough to make the point he's trying to make. Then you never know. You get to a situation like you got with ABC, where he actually did manage to extract $15 million out of them for a dispute over the right way to phrase the civil lawsuit in which he was found liable for sexual abuse. And that sends another message, right? In fact, probably emboldens President-elect Trump to try this again and again. And he outlined it at that news conference yesterday where Jeff was at. And he said he's going after Bob Woodward. He's going after the Pulitzer Board. He's going after all these different targets. Whether he wins or not, that's a bonus maybe. But I think the point he's trying to make is if you write something that I don't like, you write something I think is unfair or inaccurate, you even simply have a poll that's wrong, I may come after you.
Melanie, let's talk about another plan that Donald Trump is exacting. Today, a Republican-led House panel pushed for a federal investigation into Liz Cheney, now accusing her of witness tampering in the January 6th probe. In a statement, Liz Cheney said that the panel's report, quote, fabricates lies and defamatory allegations to cover up what Donald Trump did. Here's the thing. Republicans will have an enormous amount of political capital over the next 2 years Is this how they plan to spend it? I mean, Chris Murphy of Connecticut already pointed out on Twitter, this move against Cheney is how Donald Trump will start crippling our democracy in ways we do not realize and we will not be able to recover from.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing, Stephanie, is that Republican allies on Capitol Hill are already starting to take steps to carry out Trump's marching orders, especially as it pertains to this retribution campaign, which he did campaign on. So I don't think anyone should be necessarily surprised that this is the tack that these Republicans are taking, especially Liz Cheney. She is someone that they have gone particularly after because she lent so much credibility to that January 6th Select Committee, because without her, it would have just been Pelosi and the Democrats. But having her, someone who came from this political dynasty in the Republican Party, the Cheney name behind it, it just lent so much weight. And that is why you've seen Republicans going after her. But it's just remarkable if you take a step back and think about the fact that Liz Cheney is the one now being put in the crosshairs and potentially the FBI going after her. These rioters who stormed the Capitol and beat police are going to be pardoned, according to Donald Trump. And of course, the case against Donald Trump himself has already been thrown out. So just a remarkable shift over these last few years, what we have seen happening as it pertains to January 6th. And there's no signs that Republicans are letting this go or putting it in the rearview mirror. They want to keep investigating it.
And Liz Cheney is just one. There is a long, long list of others who are on Donald Trump's target list. What's your take, Peter?
Yeah, he said it. He said he wants to, he says Liz Cheney should go to jail. He says the entire January 6th committee should go to jail. And as we were just talking about, I mean, people are taking their cue from that. They're going to look for things that they can allege, whether they're there or not, whether they're meritorious or not, in order to try to muddy the waters, try to make it out that somehow the investigators were the wrong people, not Donald Trump himself. And it is a striking sign of what his priorities are. He's going to pardon the people, as we just said, who beat police officers, and try to put in jail the people who investigated the attack on the Capitol. And that's a striking juxtaposition there.
All right, Jeff, let's talk about somebody else in Donald Trump's orbit, RFK Jr. He was back on the Hill today. What did you make of the reaction from those Republican senators we heard from? I mean, there is sort of this eclectic group out there who back RFK, who say we're not a healthy country. We've got an obesity problem. We have a problem with our processed foods. We have a problem with a lot of the drugs coming out of big pharma and what gets pushed on us. But that group of people doesn't necessarily represent the majority of the Americans, and certainly not the majority of people in Congress. Those Republican senators weren't giving him full-throated backing.
No, they weren't. I mean, but to your point of the backing that there is there, I would add to that Governor Jared Polis of Colorado, my home state, who came out with a very positive message about RFK Jr. A few weeks ago, which I thought was really interesting coming from a Democrat. But yes, you're absolutely right to highlight some of the Republican senators who are raising concerns. One thing that I think just kind of taking a step back, the Republican Party is absolutely the MAGA party right now. It is Donald Trump's party, full stop. But that doesn't mean that Republicans writ large agree on things like vaccines not being positive. That is an RFK and a conspiracy theorist policy, really, and that's not something that is necessarily going to be supported by everyone who's supporting Donald Trump, and that includes these Republican senators who will be deciding who ends up in his cabinet. So they're raising questions about it. I thought it was interesting to go back to yesterday's press conference at Mar-a-Lago that President Trump felt the necessity to say he supports the polio vaccine. The fact that that's even something you have to say as a president-elect is sort of amazing, and he did. But he also said he was interested in seeing what kind of a report RFK Jr., if he gets confirmed, comes up with in terms of ties between vaccines and autism. So he's open to the conspiracy theories. He's open to finding out what his choice finds, what RFK Jr. finds if he gets in office. But he's also having to tamp down concerns about mass polio outbreaks coming again if there are question marks about this vaccine, which is so clearly helped humanity over the last several decades.